Our guest today is a former prosecutor, state legislator, and served as Chief of Staff for Cook County Sheriff Michael Sheehan. He holds a law degree from Loyola and a bachelor's degree in history and social studies from Providence College. Our guest today and his wife, Patricia, live in Chicago and are the proud parents of 5 children. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome back to the City Club of Chicago, Cook County Sheriff Tom Dart. Thomas? Thank you. Have fun up there.
Yeah, Jay caught me off guard. His intro is usually about 2 hours long. You know, up front, I wanted to thank a couple people because the topic I'm going to talk about, we've had so many people involved with it, and I don't want to forget anybody, but particularly we had some Notre Dame law students who helped us a lot on a lot of different aspects of what I'm about to talk about. One is Grace Donovan, David Baez, and Ana Paula Capaldo. I know 2 of you are here. Grace, thank you. In the work we were doing, the thing that was so fascinating about it is we brought together a lot of people, some of which hadn't been together in 30-some years, who had worked on the John Gacy case. And it was a tremendous help for us. We had a meeting one day where we had all the old detectives, the former prosecutors. We even had the defense attorney for Gacy working to help at different times on the case as well. And I want to thank all of them, particularly Bob Egan, who was one of the prosecutors that convicted John Gacy. Bob is here today. Bob has been instrumental in pulling together a lot of this stuff too. So Bob, thank you very much, Bob. I appreciate it. Since I took over the office years ago, we tried to put together an effort to bring a little more sophistication to some of the different cases that are traditionally called cold cases, ones that have been unsolved, that have been laying around for a while, haven't been worked on, for one reason or another, were not being looked at. One of the things we want to use is start using all the different techniques that weren't available back then, use them now, such as DNA and, frankly, computers. They weren't available during a lot of this time. Right now, as we sit here today, there are over 85,000 reported missing persons throughout the country. Of that, it's estimated that there's 40,000 unidentified deceased individuals in morgues throughout the country right now. Without the use of modern technology, there's no way to solve this crisis in our country. There is an overall need to bring contemporary investigative methods to all of these different investigations. What I did when I first became sheriff is I literally took all of our cold cases, a 1-page summary I took, and laid them all out one weekend on the floor at my house, locked the doors so the kids didn't come in, and I went through all of them. And I started circling ones that I thought there was more we can do with them. I then put together a unit, a cold case unit, that then went about surgically going through all these. And our first case was a case that we went through of an individual who had been found in the forest preserves back in years gone by. By utilizing DNA, we were able to identify this individual back in 2010. But when we started going through our cases, we found that the Sheriff's Office had more cases you can imagine that were cold for years and years. Our oldest one, some of you may have heard of, it was called the Grimes Sisters. It was 2 young girls back in the 50s who had gone missing after they'd gone into the downtown Chicago area for an Elvis movie. And they were never seen again. And their bodies were found about a month later, and that case was never solved. That's our oldest. Then we started moving through them, and then we found our largest one where we had individuals who were not identified was the John Wayne Gacy case. And for a lot of people, myself included, I was very aware of a lot of the facts about the Gacy case from growing up, but I didn't know all the nuances of it by any stretch. And I certainly was not in tune with the fact that 8 of the 33 that he killed were never identified. They were just anonymous people that were found in the crawl space. We went about trying to identify them. And in doing that, we opened up a lot of different avenues that frankly we weren't expecting. And it took us back to the case itself. And that's where people like Bob Egan were so helpful in trying to give us the understanding that we needed in trying to bring closure here. Because ultimately that's what we've been trying to do, is bring closure. To understand this and the different nuances, you really have to have some understanding of the case. And the case revolves around John Gacy, truly one of the most prolific monsters our country has ever had and seen. He was born here in Chicago in East Rogers Park back in 1942. He was the second of 3 children. He was close to his mother, had problems with his father. At age 18, he became a precinct captain for the Democratic Party. I was thinking of pulling that out. It becomes somewhat relevant because there are numerous photos live you may see where Gacy had a way of ingratiating himself to people, where he has constantly, you'll find him in pictures with politicians. There's one with him and Rosalind Carter even, that he had somehow sidled his way up there to get a picture with her as well. Gacy moved around a lot. He moved to Vegas, worked as for an ambulance company and as a mortuary attendant. He returned to Chicago, went back to school, and found a job with a Bush shoe company. The job moved him to Springfield, where he met his first wife, Marilyn. They got married. Her father owned a string of Kentucky Fried Chicken stores. He then became the manager of one of them. He became the manager of one in Waterloo, Iowa. They moved there. They were married. They had 2 children at the time. Shortly after going there, he met a young 17-year-old boy, and he assaulted him. The boy got away. He was convicted of that, and he was sentenced to 10 years for sodomy of the 17-year-old boy. The significance of that, though, as I'll tell you later, is that he was served, had a 10-year sentence. Unfortunately, he only served 18 months of that sentence. So in June of 1970, he was released, and within 24 hours of being released, he was back in Chicago living with his mother. In July of 1972, Gacy remarried a woman who had 2 daughters already. He started a construction company. He called it PDM Contractors, standing for Painting, Decorating, Maintenance. And in 1976, they eventually were divorced. He divorced his second wife as well. Between his release from prison in 1972 and his arrest in 1978, he murdered, at minimum, 33 teenage boys and young men. He buried 26 of them in his crawl space. He buried 3 elsewhere on his property. And he then dumped 4 other bodies in the Des Plaines River. The bodies he dumped in the Des Plaines River is because he had run out of space in his crawl space and around his house. He was convicted of 33 murders. He was sentenced to death for 12 of those killings. This is something that I think it goes without saying that our state and throughout the country, no one had ever seen anything like this ever, and pretty much has not seen it since. During the time that he was doing these killings, what was Gacy doing? What was he up to at that time? Well, he was living in a small house at 8213 West Summerdale in unincorporated Cook County, hence the reason the sheriff's office got involved with the case. It was a single-story, 3-bedroom ranch built on top of a crawl space. There was no basement. He was known throughout the community for his summer parties. This photograph here over my shoulder is a picture of the front of his house, and it shows the number 76. This was what he decorated his house for 1776 bicentennial. As I mentioned, he was married for a second time. This is a picture of him and his second wife at their marriage. This marriage lasted about 4 years. While he was married, he did some of his killing. As I had referenced earlier, he was somebody who craved attention. Everybody who analyzed him, all the psychiatrists afterwards, found that to be the common thread with this guy. He threw elaborate parties at his house. Here's a picture of him. That's him in the center with the chef's hat on. He would cook these big parties. Crowds would come. They would be for various reasons, whether it was for the neighborhood or whether it was from a political angle they had to it. He'd throw these. He'd do all the cooking and the entertainment, and the people would just have to bring their own liquor. And this is him at one of his parties. He also spent his time volunteering as a clown at local parties and events. This is him here in this photograph. He went by the name of Pogo the Clown. This whole thing of him being a clown, it sort of fit his personality. He was the guy that always craved all the attention, wanted everyone looking at him. This was one of the many ways he did that. During the course of the trial, they actually called a expert, believe it or not, there is such a thing, an expert on clowns. It's not just people who observe politicians, Mr. Green. And they said that the thing that was unique about this was that his whole way that he dressed himself up was contrary to what most clowns would do, because they tried to do all sorts of things with their paints and the like so that there aren't any sharp angles and edges and stuff so they don't scare people. So I think most of you would say, without even knowing what Gacy did, this is somewhat of a frightening clown. It looks somewhat demonic. His first victim came back in 1972. When Gacy was interviewed, as Bob Egan can tell you, it was always strange and difficult. He would give some information, then he wouldn't give other information. It was often thought that the only information he really gave was what he thought you already knew. So sometimes he was more forthcoming than others. So a lot of the information about some of the deaths came about from his words. And so from his words, his first killing came in 1972 in January. He killed his first victim. His name was Timothy McCoy. He met him at the Greyhound bus station. He brought him home. According to Gacy, they had sex. And according to Gacy, when he woke up, McCoy was standing over him with a knife, and Gacy killed him in self-defense. It is interesting, later on, one of the victims does have a stab wound on him that later was identified as McCoy. From this day in 1972 until his last victim, Robert Peace, in 1978, Gacy killed 33 boys and young men. He had somewhat niche groups that he focused on. He focused on the homosexual community. He focused on just outright kidnappings of people. He would do that frequently, where he would pull up in his car. He had a big black car with a spotlight on it. This was back in the mid-'70s, where those were quite rare unless you were a police officer. He'd pull up, he'd flash a badge, he'd tell you he's investigating something, get you in the car, and usually that was the last you were ever seen. We had an interesting individual call me right after we announced we were doing this work on the case about John Gacy pulling up to him. He didn't know it at the time until all of a sudden the publicity came, but he was trying to catch a bus on, I believe it was Clark Street. He was somewhere near Washington Park, which was called Bughouse Square at the time. Gacy circled the block numerous times trying to get him in the car, flashing a badge at him. When Gacy was arrested, badges were found everywhere in his house. And it was one of his ploys he would do. He'd have a black leather jacket, say he's an undercover cop, and he needed you to come with him. His other group that he would target were young men he persuaded with offers of jobs, drugs, drinking. He would have them to his house. He'd let them drink, use drugs, the whole 9 yards, and in doing that, try to entice them. Two of his youngest victims were young men named Michael Moreno and Kenneth Parker. The two of them were best friends. One was 14, one was 15 years old. They went missing on the same day. Both of them had just gone out, and they were never seen again. They were both found the remains were found in Gacy's crawl space adjacent to each other, and they were later identified as victim number 14 and 15. How did all this end? Well, it ended because of the last victim he chose. His last victim he chose was 15-year-old Robert Peace. This occurred in December of 1978. Robert was an honor student at Maine West High School, where he was also a wrestler. He was intensely loved by his family, had a lot of great friends. He worked a lot. He had jobs after school, and he worked at a pharmacy. The blue coat he has on has some relevance later on from this photograph. It's a light blue coat he wore. At the time of his disappearance, he was working at the Nissen pharmacy at Toohey and Des Plaines. These events occurred on December 11th, 1978. About 8:55 at night, his mother showed up to pick him up, which she would normally do after work. It was his mother's birthday. They were having a big birthday party back at the house for her that night. He was very close to her at the time, and she was going to pick him up and bring him home for the birthday. And they had the cake and everything waiting for him to come back. As she walked in the doors of the pharmacy, Robert told her if she can hold on, because he, as I said, had always been trying to get other work to try to make money because he was going to buy a car. And at that time, John Gacy was in the store. John Gacy, as I mentioned before, was a handyman. He had a construction company and the rest. He was in there trying to settle on a contract with that pharmacy to reorganize their shelving. And Gacy saw Robert, walked up to him, told him that he was doing, he had a construction company, he was hiring kids for the summer. Peace then was talking to Gacy. Gacy asked him if he could come outside and talk to him by his car. At that time, Robert's mom was entering the store, and she actually passed by John Gacy as he was leaving. They went outside by the car, and that was the last Robert was ever seen again. His mother waited there for him. She was in complete panic. This was not only not like him, but she had just been with him, and all of a sudden he was missing. This date is also significant because what I mentioned earlier about how Gacy had only served a short period of time of his 10-year sentence, this date, December 11th of 1978, would have been Gacy's release date if he had served his sentence. So literally none of the people killed would have been killed because he would have been in prison. What occurred then was what you would imagine, a high-profile missing person case at that point. The police were immediately called. The family spread out through the area. They were looking everywhere for him, making calls to everyone. The search eventually, immediately went to John Gacy because he was there, the last to talk to him. The police went and talked to John Gacy that morning at his house. Gacy said he didn't know anything about anything. At the time, and it's one of the things one of the detectives has talked about, the thing that he can never get off his mind, at the time, because when John Gacy killed Robert, things had happened quickly, unexpectedly, however you want to call it. He hadn't had time to dispose of the body. He'd shoved the body up in a space above the doorway. And so literally as the two officers were talking to John Gacy at the door, the body was right above their head. And they never obviously knew that. Gacy said he didn't know anything about it. The officers went away. They then get back to the station. They find out, after doing a little bit of research, that Gacy had previously been convicted of sodomy. They told Gacy they wanted to talk to him. He was supposed to come back that next day to talk with them, and he didn't show up. Gacy didn't show up at that point because he was taking the body, and he took the body and had dumped it into the Des Plaines River. He was supposed to meet the officer around 10 o'clock that night. He didn't show up till 3 in the morning. He was covered in mud because he had gotten his car stuck along the side of the road when he was trying to dispose of Robert's body. The police went and got a search warrant at that time. They felt they had enough evidence. They got the search warrant. So this is about a day and a half after he went missing. In the course of searching through the house, they came across a receipt that was in the garbage can. What it was a receipt from, I think a lot of us, I know I do, still remember that when you used to actually have cameras with film, you'd have to have them developed, and they'd put them in an envelope, and they'd rip the top part off and give it to you as a receipt. Well, yeah. I'm aging myself and dating myself here. And so when they searched through the trash in this house, say a day and a half after he went missing, they found this receipt there, and it was from that drugstore. So they took that, and they went back to the drugstore. They talked to the young girl who had been working as for the photography part of the drugstore that night, and she had said, as a matter of fact, because she sits by the door, that Robert had offered his coat to her to wear because she was so cold whenever the door would open. And so she had taken the photographs to be developed and put the receipt in the pocket, and that was the last she'd seen it. So now the police had Robert inside the house at some point. And so they began further investigation of the case. They had found, as I said, the receipt. They'd also found some handcuffs at the time. They went and looked at the crawl space, but the crawl space in his house notoriously would flood, and so when they looked down there, it was all covered in water. So they couldn't see anything at that point. They conducted surveillance on Gacy for the next 10 days, in which time it was bizarre in anyone's estimation, where he knew he was being watched. He'd lead them on high-speed chases through the area. He would then stop. He would go and have coffee with them. It was bizarre, to put it lightly. At one point then, a short time later, Gacy invited the officers actually into his house. And it was while one of the officers was in the house during that 10-day window that he had to use the restroom. When he went in the restroom, just as he was in the restroom, all of a sudden the heat kicked on. And when the heat kicked on, the fumes from the crawl space, where the water had settled by then, came into the bathroom, and it was immediate that he knew what that smell was. They then left, and a short time later they got the search warrant. It was a second search warrant for the house. The second search warrant for the house was more extensive, and at that point they knew what they had. They found the bodies down in the basement, and Gacy was taken into custody as a result of that. Gacy was held over at Cook County Hospital. This is a picture of him at Cermak Hospital. He would fake illnesses all the time. He would fake heart attacks. He would fake everything. He, as I mentioned before, would give some information, would not give other information. In this picture, he's in restraints because he was threatening to do something at that point. The photograph, was interesting. Was taken, and then it was purchased. It was taken by a correctional officer who then sold it to the Tribune. He was fired like the next day. Detectives told Gacy they didn't want to destroy his house, and so they said, if you can, we have bodies all over there. If you will tell us where they're at, it'll save your house. And so Gacy then sketched out, and this is a picture of what he sketched out on a piece of paper where all the bodies were. And it was absolutely uncanny that he, when he sketched all this out, it was virtually everywhere where the bodies were at. The next photo you see is one that was actually done later on by the people who recovered the bodies, and you can see the two almost match each other. Gacy, as I said, he ran out of space in his crawl space, so at that point he started dumping bodies into Des Plaines River. I know a lot of us have driven over the bridge. The bridge is the bridge that when you are driving down I-55 towards Springfield, right after you pass the intersection of I-80, there's a bridge that goes over Des Plaines. That's where he was dumping the bodies at the time. Four were recovered. He'd made reference to maybe a fifth body as well, but he said that may have been fallen on top of a barge that was passing underneath, and that body was never recovered. Next body, this photograph here is the photograph of Robert's body, the young man who was the last one he killed. That was found floating along the side of the river in the Des Plaines. At that point in time, the focus was on the house. There was intensive efforts on trying to excavate and try to get a full total and tally and do it in a way that was going to preserve all the evidence. They ripped up all the floorboards in the house and began then excavating down in the basement there. They took it down to virtually nothing, as you'll see in the next photographs. But here, this next photograph here is what the crawl space looked like. And it's a little hard to tell at times, but there's like white spread around. That was lye. He used to dump bags and bags of lime down there to try to get rid of the smell, because the smell had gotten so overpowering. And you could see sort of the outlines of some of the places where the bodies were at. This photo here is, you can see the outlines of the face. This was a skull that was down in the crawl space looking straight down. You can see the mouth and the like from that person who was killed by him. This next picture shows looking from the crawl space up into the house. You can see how it was taken down to, at that point, to the ground level, and the boards had all been taken off in that room. The blue jacket that we had referenced before that Robert was wearing in that photograph, here is the blue jacket. Gacy had stuffed it behind a wall in his house, and that was the one that the young woman had been wearing prior to Robert taking it back and then being grabbed by John Gacy. It also is not unusual for serial killers to hang on to souvenirs. That's something they do. Gacy did a lot of that. The evidence is incredible, and as I'm going to tell you in a little bit, one piece is very significant as it references some of the things we're doing going forward. This is Dr. Stein, who was our medical examiner at the time. He was on the scene every day and would pronounce the body dead and then record the time of recovery. These are photographs of ribs of one of the individuals that was taken. This became significant because as Gacy had acknowledged that he stabbed one guy to death to try to stab him, the one rib in there has the markings of a stab wound on it. And this was consistent with McCoy, who he acknowledged he had killed his first victim. Next are pictures that are somewhat indicative of the skeletons that were found down there, and the skull in this particular case of an individual was found down there. Next photograph is of a skull, but also rags. Gacy would stuff rags into the different orifices of the body to prevent the fluids from leaking. And so rags were found along with the skeletons, in addition to, and some of the remains, the actual rope, because the method Gacy would use traditionally in killing individuals was he'd strangle them, and he did, he called it his handcuff trick, where he'd say that he can get out of handcuffs, he'd put them on himself, get out, and then he'd ask the victim to do the same thing, and then of course they couldn't get out. He would then come behind them and with a piece of rope and then with like a piece of wood and then turn it until he strangled them to death. Many of the bodies had those ropes on them or near them. At the end of each day, the bodies were laid upstairs there before they were brought out after the medical examiner's office had gone through them, and then they'd walk each body out to be taken away. The medical records, this is very significant, what we've been working on ourselves. Is I've tried to emphasize over and over again to people, the detectives, both from Des Plaines and from our police department, phenomenal people. They did a phenomenal job, but they were so limited in what they had. There was no such thing as DNA. No one ever thought of it. The only way to identify a body at that point in time was through dental records, and that's what was done in the majority of all these cases. And here's a copy of one of the victim's dental records, and in the next photograph you can see how they utilized comparisons here to compare different dental records to make the matches. The house was taken apart piece by piece. There's a photograph of that. But after that was done, that's when the driveway and the garage were taken down as well. In the garage, they found remains of one body. In the driveway, this is actually the driveway photograph here. Body was found there. That body still has not been identified. It's one of the ones we're still working on. By April of '79, now mind you, he was arrested in December of '78. By April of '79, Gacy's house was leveled and taken away. And this is what was left after that. The jury trial, and that's a very, very young and handsome Bob Egan there in that photograph. The jury took 2 hours to find him guilty and 2 hours to sentence him to death. Bob, Terry Sullivan, and Bill Kunkel were the prosecutors, did an absolutely amazing job on this case. 2 hours to find him guilty, 2 hours to sentence him to death. On May 10th, 1994, Gacy was executed and buried at the Illinois Department of Corrections Cemetery. Here's where we come in. So when we were going about trying to identify the 8 unidentified folks, we needed 2 things. We needed to get the DNA of the victim, but we also then needed to get family members or like to come forward and give us their DNA so we can make a match. The first part of it I thought was going to be relatively simple and straightforward because I had been told forever that the 8 unidentified bodies, that their mandible bones, the jaw bones, were taken away and kept separate. The reason being those were the only way the people were identifying victims back then. So they were kept separate at the medical examiner's office while the rest of the remains were buried in an incredibly dignified way at different cemeteries throughout Cook County. The problem was that for reasons that were really not quite clear, back in 2009, our medical examiner's office thought it was a good thing to rebury the jaw bones. And so when we went looking for them, they were gone. And by that time, I had already come across the fact that the way we were burying poor people and indigent people, unidentified people in this county was horrific. We were basically dumping them in a hole out at Homewood Memorial. And I remember when my detective came in and said, you know, boss, we got a little problem with the jaw bones. And I said, what's the problem? He said, they're missing. And I said, well, that's not good. And he said, they've buried them. And I go, now, hopefully you're saying they buried them at one of these plots at one of these cemeteries, because you wouldn't be telling me that they dumped them out in the hole out at Homewood Memorial. He said, well, I could lie to you. And so sure enough, they had dumped all the jaw bones into the hole out at Homewood Memorial. And when I say a hole, the hole was just that. It was 8, they acknowledged 8, but it was up to 16 bodies deep out there. So there's this humongous hill, it's still out there at Homewood Memorial, that is all remains of people. It's all over the place, no markings, no nothing. You can't find anything out there. We thankfully, because the jaw bones had more recently been buried, we had a general idea where they were at. The only marking system they had there is they have a dead tree that's in the back, and you mark off with your feet how many steps to get there. We were able to locate the general area and then we had to get an order to exhume the jaw bones that were out there. I was out there, our detectives were out there. It was very unpleasant because we had to dig through other bodies to get to it because it wasn't exactly where it was supposed to be. So we were able to get the 8 jaw bones, though, eventually. We took them and we flew them down to the University of Northern Texas Center for Human Identification. It's an amazing group of people who've done all this work for free. And that was one of the things I kept reiterating to people. This is not, it's extensive amount of county resources being devoted to this. This is all being done free by numerous people. And so we sent them down there. Testing was successful, however, on only 4 of the jaw bones because of the deterioration that occurred. So we then had to go get a second exhumation order. And on October 11th, 2011, we then went and, I'm sorry, prior to that, we got the second exhumation order, went out to the cemeteries where the 8 bodies had been buried that I mentioned before, and we dug up the 4 we needed to get more DNA from and submitted those, and we were able to get enough DNA out of that. In October of 2011 is when we made our announcement to the public that we needed them to come forward to give us their DNA. In a matter of seconds, we had our phones ringing off the hook with people coming forward. We have over 150 leads and over 45 family reference samples representing 30 different missing persons. One of the first leads that we got was submitted by a woman named Laura O'Leary. Her maiden name was Laura Bundy. Her brother also donated as well. Their brother Bill had gone missing in 1976. He'd left his house to go to a party. He'd left his wallet at the house, and that was the last they'd seen of him. The general area where they lived was not far from where Gacy operated and where he lived. After Gacy was arrested, the family immediately went to the medical examiner's office and said that they feared that their brother was one of the missing unidentified people. They were told to go get the dental records, as I mentioned before, because it was the only way to identify people. Their dentist had retired, and so then they were able to track him down. It turned out when he retired, he destroyed all the records from the practice. So there was no way to make any identification. There was nothing the family could do. They gave us their DNA, and we submitted that DNA to the University of North Texas, and as a result of that, we were able to make the match and to affirm that William was one of the victims. It was very surreal. I remember talking to the family when we told them about it. I didn't know how they were going to take it, but there was this incredible sense of closure that they'd been looking for. They were not happy to hear what was the result, obviously, of their brother, but to finally have closure was something they'd been craving all their life. We notified them of this in November of 2011. We then went, myself and Jason Moran, who's been phenomenal. Jason's been almost a one-man show on this from our office. He's just done an amazing job. We accompanied the family to Resurrection Cemetery, where Bill had been laying. That's where he was buried. And I mentioned before when the cemeteries, Bill buried the 8 different ones at different cemeteries. Bill had been buried all these years out at Resurrection. We learned from Laura that the family already has relatives buried out there, and for years they've been going to that cemetery, and we're driving right by Bill's grave, not knowing it. So we were able to bring closure to that family for this. We're still continuing our efforts to try to bring closure on the rest of the cases. Since the start of the investigation, we've been able to close 7 leads by locating other people as well. We've located 5 missing people who are still alive and 2 who had died of natural causes. So because of the DNA that was submitted, we were able to track it back to different people. One was an individual who had died in a hospital of natural causes, and the other one had died also in a hospital as well. So we brought closure to those 2 families about that. We've also found, as I mentioned, 5 living people who, for a myriad of reasons, had left their families back in the 70s because of fights, misunderstandings, all the rest of it. We've reunited them. Most of their reuniting has been positive. And it's brought a great deal of closure to a lot of families. Harold Wayne Lavelle, he disappeared from Aurora in May of '77 as a 19-year-old. He told his family he was going to try and find a construction job, and they had never seen him again. We found him down in Florida, and we united the family down in Florida together. Ted Szal left Glen Ellen at age 24 because of a disagreement with his family. He thought his family didn't love him. His parents are still alive. His father is 87 and his mom's 79. The father had kept a picture of Ted in his breast pocket his whole life. He'd always carried it around his breast pocket. They had found Ted's car near O'Hare Airport, and he had worked construction, so it was a lot of different things that led people to believe he was a Gacy victim. He was found married with children living in Beaverton, Oregon. Since reopening the case, we've received 150 leads, I mentioned. 74 have been cleared and closed, meaning that we've brought resolution in one form or another. DNA samples have been collected from family members of missing people throughout the United States. To date, we have 46 reference samples that have been collected representing 30 missing people from all around the United States. We've located, as I mentioned, missing people. We've closed things that people really didn't think we'd ever be able to close. And so it's been an incredible thing that we've been able to get done. We've got quite a few cases we're still working on, to be honest with you, as far as getting the DNA from family members and getting it down to University of North Texas. So we have about 28 open leads we're still working on. One of the more, at least for me, more emotional cases of mine was in regard to a young man named Daniel Noe. This is one of the reasons why, and this is one of the primary examples of why people who have individuals who are missing, and they don't think bad things have happened, but they want to find them, they need to give their DNA. Because by only getting it into the system can we try to make a match. Daniel's parents had no thought that their son was involved with John Gacy. Incredibly bright young man. He was at Northwestern University. He left in the middle of a semester because he wanted to take some time off. He and his friend, and I met his friend, really nice gentleman, they went hiking. They just did a cross-country road trip. They went hitchhiking, took off to Washington. They were out in Washington for about 9 months, and then Daniel wanted to go back and he wanted to finish up school. His friend, who I met, dropped him off at a highway right near Utah to head back to Chicago to go to school. The parents were just concerned because on that route takes them by where Gacy was killing people. And so on a lark, the parents put their DNA into the system. What we found was that Daniel had died. He died peacefully on the side of a mountain in Utah. As luck would have it, back in 2010, because of all of the lack of winter that we're having these days, a side of a mountain in Utah had melted. It hadn't melted in years, and what it exposed were some human remains. The deputies in Utah put them in the database. Daniel's parents had given us their DNA, and we made the match of the remains on the side of the mountain. Myself and Jason Moran went down to talk to the family down. They live in a small town called Washington, just east of Peoria. And the nicest parents, they're in their 80s, and it was just the sense of closure to them that their loved one has been found, his remains were going to be buried, and they kept telling me about how it's going to mean so much to them to have their son buried next to them now. And they had the remains sent to Washington and buried in the plot right by them. There's also a case we're working on right now, a very high-profile case from 1973 from the East Coast, where 2 kids left an orphanage and were never seen again. And remains were found. Once again, because of all the attention we brought to this case, DNA was submitted, and we have some preliminary work. We don't have it quite done yet that we might have solved something out in the East Coast that had been out there forever. As I mentioned before, we've been utilizing all sorts of different investigative tools. The students from Notre Dame have been so amazingly helpful because we've been pouring through all these boxes from the Gacy case that have been sitting there for decades and not exactly kept in the best condition either, mind you. And in doing that, we've been able to go through records that had never been gone through. Law enforcement didn't have the ability to, they didn't have computers, so they couldn't categorize anything. We've been going through this. When we were going through one of the envelopes, inside one of the envelopes, we open it, and inside the envelope is vials of John Gacy's blood. Well, we then just assumed that that blood had been entered into databases and the whole like. It turns out they never had been. And we then, once again, Jason, really pushed it because there's a limited number of reasons you can enter stuff into the database. Having a case that occurred where somebody's been executed back in the 90s, there was no legal way to do it. But because Gacy is actually legally considered the victim of a homicide because the state put him to death, we were able to enter him into the system as a homicide victim. Clever, huh? I wish I could tell you I thought of it. And in doing it this way, when you think of it, the value of this is that any homicide where a detective or detectives were very meticulous in how they handled a case back in the 70s, an open case, they now will have the ability to cross-reference it to Gacy. And the thing that's been fascinating, on the day we did the press conference announcing that we did this, we had a jurisdiction call us from Michigan who had a case of two high-profile young boys who were strangled and murdered in 1975, I think it was. Open case, never solved. Lot of indications of some of the way Gacy acted. Through Notre Dame students' work, some of everything, we also have physical records that have Gacy in that general area too. So we're working on that case as we speak now to see if we can match his blood to some of the evidence that was taken at the crime scene then. The other area that we're working on as well, once again, the prosecutors, detectives had their hands full at this case. They did a phenomenal job in convicting this monster and having him executed. The other part of it, though, is that his travel records were really never thoroughly examined. Once again, they had no databases and any ability to do that. Gacy traveled extensively. We have records of him all around the country, traveling at numerous locations. And so we're working with the FBI, and they have a unit called VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehensive Program. And what they do is they'll take our records that we put together of where Gacy traveled, and they'll lay it over the United States to any open case where young men fitting the profile were found dead during that time frame that were never solved. And then we can work backwards to see if we can connect it to Gacy. They're in the process of doing it now. We're going to have something moving along on that next month for sure. You know, I've had people at times question, Gacy out of town and this, him killing elsewhere, and there was some evidence at trial from some psychiatrists who said, no, he liked to have control over his victims, and that's why he probably didn't kill elsewhere. And I always found it beyond credibility to think he didn't murder elsewhere, based on the fact he was such a monster. We have records of him traveling extensively. But one of the things that really put that issue to rest was, in doing all of this work, one of the people that we found alive, who had been listed missing all these years, we found him down in Florida. And we interviewed him, and he had said John Gacy was down in Florida, and John Gacy was driving in a car. He was walking. John Gacy flagged him over, got him in the car, said he was a police officer, tried to attack him. The guy was able to run out of the car and get away. The thing that was so fascinating about this is his name is on a driver's license found inside John Gacy's house that no one had known until now, that ID is sitting in Gacy's house, because he used to collect all these IDs from people he attacked. When we asked him about it, he said, when I ran out of the car, I threw anything I had at him to get away, and one of the things I had in my hand was my wallet, and I threw it at him. And Gacy kept the ID. And so we're now working our way through a lot of those aspects of the case right now. The other part that's been getting some attention is a search warrant over on Miami and Elston. A lot of different indications. There's people that have talked about it. I'm not trying to give the odds that there are bodies there or not. We don't know. We just at this point want to run that out and make sure that we've exhausted every viable area that we have information on. There was a retired officer who had said he saw Gacy on that property with a shovel. His mother used to live in there. The thing that we found interesting is through the work of the Notre Dame students, we found numerous pieces of documents that show Gacy detailing the different construction work he did at that location. So was he there? Yes. Did he do construction work there? Absolutely he did. Was he doing digging there? Yes, he was. So we have a search warrant now to go to that property. We are waiting on not just the weather, but also to get a cadaver dog from the FBI so that we can do it. So we don't have a time certain on that yet. Just finally, my last thought, I can't emphasize enough to you folks how important this whole notion is. To bring closure to families, God, do they deserve this. The notion that there's 40,000 people sitting in morgues right now that are unidentified, that's a horrific number, and it's something that we need to do. And so we need to get people understanding that for missing loved ones, you need to put DNA. It's easy to do. It takes seconds to get it in the database. But it's also imperative that we have a template for all of the different medical examiners, coroners throughout the United States that they know what to do with these bodies. We have done it now in Cook County as of about a year ago. We put the template together for our county so that we don't have that. But here's the thing that eats at me is that, as I mentioned earlier, for years we used to just unceremoniously dump these poor people out in this hole, and it was a hole, out in a hole at the cemetery. 16 people deep, no markings, no anything, no way to find them. Within that universe of people, there's 401 people that were never identified, that there was no DNA taken from their bodies, we couldn't find them if we wanted it. So that if you have a family where, say their child, say their daughter, who they loved intensely, had problems with narcotics, who had left, they didn't know where, they've been looking everywhere, and all of a sudden they find information that she was last seen in the city of Chicago. Then searching through missing persons, you find, well, wow, we found a body, a deceased body of an individual who fits those characteristics. If that family either A, wanted closure, or B, wanted to bring the body home to bury, they could never, ever do that. Because the horrific mismanagement, the lack of thought that was put into this, they could never find those bodies. They will forever be out in that hole. They'll never know if it was their daughter. They'll never know whether or not, how their child died, and that's horrible. And I know that we could not be the only county to botch this thing up so bad. So this is imperative that we as a group find this is an issue that we need to draw attention to and bring some closure to. Thank you.
I think we heard enough. How about another round of applause for the sheriff?